Hi, I'm Lynn from L&J Goods in Medina, New York. Today we are going to learn all about the Carrera Marble Stamp from Iron Orchid Designs and kind of take a deep look into getting a really awesome faux marble finish using the stamp and some other products that I'm going to introduce you to. Thinking about the very first time that this stamp was introduced to us by Josie and Sally, and the amazement that I had that they could actually create a stamp which would give us the look of marble. So I started playing around with this. This sat on my shelf for many months until one day I finally decided to get it out and use it. I used it just as is, just like this. I rolled my paint on it. I stamped it down and built up layers and layers of stamped paint. Did a little bit of blending, but it looked fine. But to me, I wanted something a little more realistic looking. I started playing around with some of my fusion mineral paints and the mediums that I could use with the paints to give me a more realistic look. I also started to work on some sample boards. And before we even start looking at any of the products and really getting into the technique, I would encourage you to do some practice boards. I did lots of them. It allowed me to play with different ratios, different colors, and really get a sense of what was an appropriate look for using this stamp. You can use them to, put a candle on as a little layering piece. You're not going to waste these boards by any means. Let's talk about the products that we're going to be using today. I am using a wood round from Home Depot or Lowe's. These are already pre-assembled. They're nice sturdy pieces, and I want to look for the ones that are nice and flat and have as few knot holes as possible. This I can use for either a tray, or I can attach a Lazy Susan mechanism to the bottom of it. You can also buy a pre-made wood Lazy Susan. Those are available on Amazon. I actually use this one from IKEA. It does have a very glossy finish, so you want to be aware of that. Make sure you sand it really well so that you have good adhesion with your paint. I'm going to be using Fusion Mineral Paint. I chose Casement, which is a nice bright white, Ash, which is a deep charcoal gray. I am also going to be using the Fusion Clear Glaze, Fusion Extender, the Clear Tough Coat in a gloss. We need a couple of brayers. These are the IOD brayers. We need an assortment of paintbrushes, some shop cloths, a little bit of warm water, a sanding block. I'm also going to be using a bin primer. Now, today's project, I am using the Fusion Rose Gold Metallic, the Peony, and Damask paints as well. Right, I think that's it. So let's get started. These wood rounds are unfinished, and we have to treat them in a little bit of a different way. If you have a knot hole, what I would encourage you to do is use the bin shellac spray or a bin shellac base primer. These wood knots have wood tannins in them that will eventually bleed through your paint. For example, right here. Shake this up in a well-ventilated area. I want to spray any of those knot holes. Give them a spray. That is enough to seal the wood tannins in right at the surface. Let that dry completely. I want to make sure that my board is nicely sanded, and then I'm going to begin to apply my casement paint. As you do each layer, the grain is going to lift on the first layer or two. So between layers, you're going to want to sand back any roughness that's occurring, especially around the edges here. It's going to happen. Whenever you paint over raw wood, it lifts the grain and you're going to get a rough finish. We want as ultra smooth a finish as possible. So between each layer, I am sanding to knock down any grain that raises and to even flatten out and soften the Fusion Mineral Paint layers. So as many coats as you need to get appropriate coverage. This is already dry, so I would be ready to paint right over that. I'm not going to show you how to paint. Most of us already know how. I have a board that's ready. I have sealed my knots. I've put several layers of casement paint on my project. I've sanded it. It's nice and smooth. When you take your Carrera Marble Stamp out of the package, the first thing you want to do is take your sanding block and you want to sand over your stamp. Why do we do this? This is going to roughen up that textured stamp side so that it receives the paint better. It gets rid of any little maybe factory residue, that shininess, slickness that might be on there. It really does help to receive the mediums better. You only have to do that one time. I'm actually just using 2 colors to create the whole Carrera marble look. At the end of the video, like I said, I'm going to show you how we added a little bit of a glammed up look with the pinks. I'm pouring out my casement. I want a nice big surface in order to mix my paint. I'm pouring out a little bit of ash as well. I love this paint. It has a built-in top coat. It's really durable and strong. You can use this on countertops as well, as long as you prep appropriately. I've poured out my paint on my mixing surface. I've poured out some white. I've poured out a little bit of ash. And now I'm going to mix about an equal amount of the clear glaze into the white. Okay, so I'm going to mix that. You're going to have lots of paint to work with here. So I'm just giving this a mix. This will do my whole tray easily. This is kind of my base color, and then I'm going to continue with different shades of gray by adding ash into this. All right, I'm going to pull just a little bit of this aside. And I'm going to just pick up just on the tip of my tongue depressor, just a little bit of ash. I want this first layer to be a very, very pale gray. The key to the realism is 2 things. It's mixing very gradient shades of the gray. We're going to go darker with each successive layer. And the other thing is in order to avoid that stamped on layered up paint appearance, we use this extender mixed with the paint. Every time that we pour out paint to use with our stamps, we're going to be mixing extender into it, about an equal amount. It's a medium that will provide some translucency to your paint without thinning it out and without affecting the pigment. So there again, it's a very, very light shade. I found that I could get a much more realistic look by removing my stamps and using them randomly, turning them every which way in different positions and so forth. So I'm going to lay out my first stamp. I took the largest one because I am working on the largest area right now. I'm using my brayer. I'm loading up my brayer. By putting that extender in, it does have a little bit of slip to it, so you've got to really work your brayer to get it coated on all sides. And there we go. I don't care if I have perfect coverage. It doesn't matter. That's the one thing that I want you to be aware of with this. None of it has to be absolutely perfect. And I'm just going to start laying down a background of this very pale gray. Now you might think, oh my gosh, I can hardly see that. That's okay. We want to continue to add layers. And I am going to do an entire background here with this very pale gray. And see how I turned my stamp around? The other thing you want to do is change the position of it and where you start it on your board. And you're also wanting to work in one direction. If you look at marble in nature, you'll see that it has a distinct growth pattern or grain pattern to it. And so you want to keep it moving in the same direction all the time. We are trying to build layers and build depth and build translucency so that it looks the most realistic. Now I've taken my blue shop cloth, I've wet it, and I've squeezed out almost all of the water. This is key. Every time that you put an extender down, you want to blot it now with your shop cloth. The extender gives us a little bit more open time, and what I mean by open time is it allows me to manipulate the paint because it dries slower. So I am blotting. I'm taking down any surface that looks like it's raised up with the blobs of paint. We don't want blobs of paint. We want to really knock that down, blot it out. And I'm twisting, turning my cloth a little bit, and just looking to flatten this out and really blend my paint into the background. Using the extender, like I said, makes that possible because it slows down the drying time. And what I like about it is it does have that it adds that transparency to the paint, so it doesn't look so stamped on. You're gonna have so much fun with this stamp. I'm gonna blot. I have covered the entire surface with that palest gray mix, and now I'm coming in with my paper towel and I'm blotting back and blending that stamped mixture of paint and glaze. And boy, does that look pretty already. Okay, next step, I am going to grab another little bit of paint on my tongue depressor, that dark ash, and I'm gonna mix that into my current gray mix. So each mix that I'm doing, I am deepening by very slight gradients. We don't want to jump from pale gray to dark veining all at once. Totally loses the realism. You want layers. It's kind of like, you know, when you're doing makeup, you put the primer on, you do a little concealer, you do all of those pretty steps and blend it out to give a really beautiful finished look. I've chosen another one of my stamps. And I'm going to start to lay this little slightly deeper shade of gray over. I don't want to put this over the entire surface. The darker I go, the less I want to see of that color. Because I'm going to start to establish some patterns of darker veining eventually. And see, I don't mind if I overlap it a little bit, that's fine. I'm going to turn this. See how I started it down at one end? That's the beauty of these stamps, is no matter how you lay them on here, as long as you're going in one direction, it's going to be perfect. My damp cloth again. And I'm going to blot. I'm also going to start to go right down over the edge if I want to. On our project, we're going to be adding a rose gold metallic edge to this, but if you were doing a dresser top, you would want to make sure that whatever you did here, you are going down over the edge and creating those same areas of veining down over the edge. And you would blot those as well. I'm rearranging my cloth. I don't want this too wet, but I'm knocking back that paint that has the extender mixed into it. And I can't stress enough, you don't want every stamp layer that you do to cover the entire board. We're gonna start to create areas of dark and light. And then as we go on, we're gonna do even more detail in those darker rivers of marble. I'm twisting. I'm turning my cloth as I blot so that I don't have a recognizable pattern, and this just softens the edges of that paint and that stamp. Go right down over the edge and blot there as well. I'm going to finish this up. And you can see I haven't added any other paint to this, which is nice. It really, you can get by with just one of these little sample sizes. And blot every time that I stamp, I blot. Okay, so you can see that I am developing some areas of the darker shade of gray right here. I don't want it to look zebra striped. I'm kind of being a little bit random with that, but you're gonna see how as we add deeper colors and less of them, it's going to look even more realistic. See here, I have my little pile of paint. I'm still working off of that same little pile. Remember, the darker I go, the less paint I'm going to be using. I'm gonna pick up another little tip of ash and mix it in to my previous mix to give myself the next darker shade. I really, really love working with the glaze because it does provide some translucency, and I just think that's so pretty. Okay, I'm taking one of my next stamps in this deeper shade of gray. Like I said, the glaze has a little bit of, it has some slip to it, so it wants to slide along my plastic mount versus rolling, so I have to really make sure that I get that completely covered. And I'm going to apply that next darker shade onto a stamp. Now I'm going to concentrate this color in an even smaller area. Down, go right over the edge. Look at that. I'm turning it. And you can see now I'm starting to deviate just a little bit with my graining. That's just going to give me a more realistic look. This is so fun to work on, and you know, the beauty of it is if you goof up, you can paint over it. And try it again. Or you just wipe it back, because honestly, with the extender in here, you've got enough open time where if you don't like it, you can really wipe it right off. Okay. And the other thing to keep in mind, guys, is when you are doing a project like this with many layers and these different techniques, keep in mind that you're looking at it right up close. You're seeing it right here, but when you step back from this, you're gonna see it from a whole different perspective. Okay, I think that's good. This just looks too stripy. So I'm gonna take one of my other stamps. This is a little shorter one. Gives it a little bit more of an organic look. I'm gonna take my towel, squeeze it out, and we will start blotting this. It always looks so glaringly like stamped and obvious until you start blotting. And it kind of blends right in the background what it's doing, because that previous layer still is open. It still has a little wetness to it. And so this is kind of, you're pushing it into the previous background ever so slightly, and it's mixing with those other colors and really does blend in so that it takes away that very obvious striping. That's the beauty of working with the extender. I don't want it to look obviously stamped. I cannot say that enough. As I'm using my cloth too, I'm kind of crumpling it up and rearranging it as well. Where we had that very dark striped look now is very softly blending into my previous layers. When you look up close, you can still see all of those layers that we added underneath, and it really looks pretty. If you were doing this on a countertop, you would want to make sure your surface is very well prepared. I did a kitchen countertop video for IOD. We'll link to that also, so you can see how I prepped my countertops. I just painted Formica countertops, and they're holding up nicely, really nicely. It's a nice fix, a nice update to old countertops. Now you can see I have some bubbling that occurred here. That means I had too much water in my paper towel. I should have squeezed it out a little bit more. You don't want those tiny little droplets of water. If you find you're getting bubbling, right away squeeze out more water. Now I want to add even a deeper area of veining so that I'm actually working from the whole area with the lightest gray. Next layers were a deeper gray. Next layer was a little bit deeper. This time I'm gonna narrow my focus even more by taking my ash paint. I'm grabbing a little bit on the end of my tongue depressor and I'm mixing it right into that previous pile. I'm actually also pulling in a little bit of my white. Okay, and here we go. So this is even darker. It's funny when you're mixing it, you kind of question, like, is it really darker? When you lay it on the project piece, you can see that it is. So again, I'm using a smaller stamp because I'm starting to define some smaller, darker areas. Our very darkest coloring is going to be saved for the actual veining detail. You can see how now I'm going into a smaller, more concentrated dark area where I'm going to want the veining to occur. And this is where at this stage I might look for a place that I want to do a rogue vein. I don't want to create one more very vertical stripe. I want this to come off. This avoids that very patterned striped look. Taking my cloth, we're seeing all of these wonderful little spots and little marbling details. Remember, if you're doing a dresser top or if you don't want to paint your edge a contrast color, everything that you do on the top, you want to take right over the side. The more you practice with this technique, the more realistic it can become. Usually when I get to about this stage, before I start adding my other veining detail, I'm gonna let this sit for a little bit and let those layers kind of melt into each other. You don't wanna overwork it. If you overwork it, you're gonna lose a lot of that detail. So at this point, I'm good with this. I'm gonna let this kind of sink in. I'm gonna let it dry for a bit, maybe a couple of hours. I'm gonna let this sit for a bit and come back to it to begin our finishing veining detail. We're back. We have let this set for a couple of hours. It's pretty much dry. So I'm going to now concentrate on doing some of this deeper veining that we see right here. Now I'm going to be working with just this ash paint. I'm going to pull that aside actually and maybe add a little bit more. I'm going to mix that because I know I've got a little light paint in there. That's okay. It does not have to be. There's no science to this. There's no, calculations that are required. I am going to be using now my Fusion Extender. Fusion Extender is a medium that you would add to your paint, and it gives you an even longer open time, an even longer drying time, whereas the clear glaze that we were using simply gives the paint more translucence. Other applications for the extender would be to put some into your finish coat and you're painting a piece of furniture, for example. It flattens out the paint, allows it to dry a little bit slower, and eliminates much of the brush strokes that you might get. So it's really a useful tool. I love it to do this kind of detail work for blending, for drawing out those details. So I'm gonna just mix. You need very little. I just have a couple of drops that I'm mixing with my paint at this point. The first little bit I'm going to put on here is going to be on this little skinny stamp. I'm not even going to brayer the whole thing. I have a nice clean brayer. This is the ash paint with a few drops of the extender. And I'm going to apply it to this skinny stamp. You can see I'm not even applying it to the whole stamp. I'm just kind of going along one side of it. Because remember, we want an even smaller area of this darkest veining. If I get any on my stamp where I don't want it, I'm going to just wipe it back with a paper towel. And in those darker areas that I had laid down, I'm now going to apply this very deepest veining. Let's go like this. Okay, that's all I want for now. And same thing, I'm just gonna take my damp paper towel, squeeze it out, really squeeze it out. And I'm going to begin to blot this as well. And now I'm even concentrating my blotting even smaller. Very often what I'll do is I'll wrap my shop cloth right around my finger and I'll start to blot like that. I can take my paper towel, I can pull it, as long as I have it right on the edge of my finger. I can blot, and then I can also drag it to really create some detailed blended veining. Using that extender in there really does help us to get a good blend on it. can kind of drag my finger in it a little bit. That's what's great about the extender too, is that you have the ability to pull that paint to make it flow off of your paper towel. You see, I'm working now with little. I'm using a very small section of my shop cloth just on my finger to really get those details. And I can also pull that extender through. You would not have enough time if you did not put the extender in there to do this kind of detailed shading. Just, you wouldn't be able to do it. Your paint, because you're using such a small amount, would dry so quickly that it would be impossible. So this truly does help you to get sweet little details that you can blend right into your marble. This is actually one of my favorite ones to use. It's this one that has that little line right along the edge. I'm going to brayer my paint on just along the edge. You can see I'm not doing the whole thing. I'm just going to go right along this very edge here. I kind of switch these up a little bit so that my veining doesn't all look identical. I want to take advantage of all the different texture that's built right into these stamps. Squeeze out my cloth. Off the edge of my finger, I'm going to start blotting. It's so much more realistic when you've got the lightest shade of gray in the very background going to this deepest veining. That little bit of contrast really does add to the realism. And true, if you look at those, if you look at real marble, you're going to see those areas of veining. Here I had quite a bit on my stamp, so I have actually removed some of that, but I've kept just the edge. I love this because I can take my finger and bring it right along here, almost to draw out a vein as well. See this? Kind of drawing it out and blending that out. I'm extending that vein from these little bits of stamped areas. The true test, seriously, is when you step back from this, you'll be amazed at the realism. I don't want to go too heavily on the veining. I just want it to look realistic. I over painted this one, so we can show you how to remove some of that again. What this does is it lays a base of that texture down, and then we can manipulate it by blending. Like here, see, too big of a blot, so I can literally wipe that right back. Or I can take my cloth and I can use that blob to extend it out, to draw it out, and give you more veining. But now watch how where I had too much paint, I'm really cleaning that up. I still have that veined look, I still have that darker color, but I'm blending it with my shop cloth wrapped around my finger and just ever so lightly patting and blending to give that realism. And again, you're looking at it right up close as you're working on it now. Tomorrow it's going to look completely different. I have let my tray sit for a bit, and as I said, I like to give this maybe an overnight or so, just to, or at least a few hours, just to settle in and let all those layers kind of settle. I don't want to really overwork this. You can see, remember that we added this pretty veining. We've started that, and that really does create that deep, beautiful vein that begins to make our marble look more realistic. Now I'm going to show you one other technique in order to create some veining, some additional detail. I am using a liner brush. This is just a #1 liner. What I need is my ash paint, which I have out, and I'm going to use a little bit of Fusion Extender as well. So I'm just going to pour a little puddle of this onto my palette. And I've wet my brush, and remember that the Fusion Extender increases the flow of your paint. It gives it the ability to be drawn out. You can blend more with it and increases that open time quite a bit more. When we're working with a small amount of paint, it dries very quickly. That's why I like to use the extender for these final steps in creating veining on the Carrera marble. I'm holding it so loosely in my hand that it kind of wiggles back and forth. And I'm generally following that outline of the area that I had previously stamped. It's barely resting on my hand. Then I'm going to take my paper towel again and my water, and I want to, again, I want to blot this. I don't want any paint to go on my board without then blotting it. At this point, I'm really just drawing that paint out, lightly tapping it just like we did when we stamped that on there, but I really love the way this detail pops when we use the liner brush and the paint mixed with the extender. There are a lot of interesting ways now that we'll be doing to create some pools of lighter color that have and add a little more translucence to another layer. But you can see how this really does define this even more. You can use either method to create your veining. You can either use your stamp like we just did, or you can use the brush with the flow medium, or you can use a combination of both. I tend to do a little of both. What's nice about using the flow medium and the brush is that if you have any areas here, like here where I have lost that connection of the vein, it doesn't matter. It's fine if it's like that, but if you wanted to make sure, again, I'm holding this so lightly that it kind of wobbles around on my hand as I draw it across. And then I'll take my shop cloth just on the end of my finger, and again, I'm just going to very gently, very lightly. I'm working in such a small area, right almost off of my fingernail to blot this, but truly this is what gives your piece that realism. It's when you pay attention to this kind of detail. You can take a really, really soft brush. This is used, it's very soft. Over here, before this completely dries, I can even come back in with this brush, and this even softens that line even more. And do the same thing over here. Again, this is before it completely dries. Very light touch. But it blends that out and softens that harsh line. I like that. That's very pretty. If there's an area where I feel like maybe this is a little bit too dark, I can always come back in with my white paint that has the glaze in it, and I can tap over that to soften it. So while we've got our glaze out and our white paint, I'm going to actually pour just a touch more. This is the clear glaze. A little goes a long way. And this is my white paint. I'm going to show you how to create some pools of highlight. I'm mixing the white with the glaze about 1:1. Remember, with this project, anytime that I put paint on my surface, I'm going to mix it with the glaze, or I'm mixing it with the extender, depending on which technique I'm doing. So I'm taking this flat, fluffy artist brush here, and I'm dipping into that white paint that's mixed with the extender, and I'm going to kind of pick an area, maybe pick a side where I want to create some highlight and some pools of light on my piece. I think I'm going to come along here. I don't need to do this through that entire veining. I'm just going to pick some areas, and what this does is it creates a little bit of brightness. So I use my brush to really blend that out. It's always surprising to me what a difference this step makes when you then step away from it, and I can actually see it right from here. But I will take my damp cloth then, really wring it out, and just lightly tap along the outside edges where your paint is. So you don't want a harsh edge right along your vein. This helps to blend that out. Okay, and we're gonna work maybe a little bit over in here. I'm going to take my cloth, lightly blotting. You still have that transparency because of the extender, so that it shows the Carrera Marble stamping that we did underneath, but it brightens this up just a little bit. We're going to continue. Again, this is just a fat, soft little brush. I'm choosing some areas along one side of my veining. And those areas will kind of pop out to you. I don't want to go straight along that whole vein because I have some really neat, little darker patches going in there. And then I'll come back in with my cloth and just blot that out and blend. You can still see the shadows of that Carrera Marble stamping that we did underneath, and we want that. We don't want to lose any of that. But what's nice is, as I showed you over here before, if you have an area that's a little bit too dark for you, say right here, maybe you don't like the way that looks, it's a little too dark, you can always brush over it with some of that white mixed with the extender, and it really softens that down. And we'll want to add some pools of highlight here and there, especially where you see that it might be, maybe just a little muddy looking. And I honestly, I don't mind a little bit of muddy looking, because to me that kind of lends itself to the more organic quality of marble. To me, it gives it a little more vintage. Like if you look at vintage marble, you can see areas where it has deepened over time. All right, so I would probably let this sit. I'm gonna assess if I need to add a little more, mix a tiny bit of my ash and white. I can brayer that on. And maybe I missed this area, or I want to create a little bit more depth. And then blot. You kind of have to know when to stop too, because we can really get carried away with this. I want to show you, if you are finding you have some areas that are just a little too dark for your liking, you can take one of the Carrera Marble stamps and you can actually stamp right over top of what you previously did. It's just going to add more translucent layers, and the overall effect will be very soft blending. Okay, that is beautiful. I'm gonna leave this just as it is. I'm gonna let it sit and dry completely before I would put a finish on it. I'm gonna continue to do my edges. I think I'll go over the edge of this board. I haven't decided yet, that's okay. Or I could paint this. I mean, look how pretty with a metallic. You could just paint the edge with gold, pop some gold handles on there. That's another option. But what I want to do is show you on a sample board how we got this effect with the rose gold. So I have pulled 3 different fusion paints. This is Damask, a pretty brownish pink. That's Fusion Peony, and metallic rose gold. We're gonna pour that out because we may be using a little of that as well. I'm gonna grab a little bit of white. I'm gonna pour out the last bit of my glaze. Make a nice puddle of that. And I'm going to start with this darkest color. This is, again, the Fusion Damask. It's that brownish gray, but you could kind of experiment and do a lot of fun techniques with this. So I would do this actually before I finished all of my veining. Like, I think it would be better if you do want to introduce other color, do all that before your final veining. Let's get a little bit of that Damask down, and I'm not going to do it all over. I'm just going to choose a few areas. Take my cloth, I'm going to blot. Every time I apply my paint, I'm mixing it with the extender and then I'm blotting it back to keep that transparency. Now I'm going to add a little bit of this pink into it. This is my glaze. Here's some pink. I do have a tiny bit of that Damask in here. It doesn't matter. There's no science to it. Kind of adding that so it's not quite as bright. And I will apply this in the same areas where I had the Damask, but maybe not quite as much. Remember, the lighter I go, the less of that color I'm going to use, no matter what color it is. And if you wanted to, I mean, you could even add just a touch of your metallic. That could be very pretty. I would go with an even smaller band of that. Right along the other veining. And I'm blotting. What a great look. I love it. So at this stage, after I've laid down that pink, that's when I would come in. I would create that darker veining. You could either do that with the ash, or you might want to create a darker veining even with a deep metallic, but I kind of like the ash. Pop in. Blend that out. Very pretty. Gives it a little more. Come in with my dry brush. Whoops, that's a little too wet. I would definitely want to wait until that's a little bit drier. I'd let this sit for a minute before I worked with that blending brush. All right. Okay, we're going to do a couple of things just to finish off our tray. I'm going to take that metallic because I'm going to finish out this pretty rose gold look, and I'm going to paint the edge of my tray. This is going to take a few layers because metallics are a little more transparent, but that will finish that off so nicely. So just use a smaller brush. You could decide if you didn't want the metallic edge, you could take your stamp, remember, and go right over the edges with every application of that Carrera Marble Stamp and blend those edges like I demonstrated earlier. You might want to choose to do a different metallic color, like a gold would be beautiful. But really all you need is just a little sample size. But that really finishes it off so nicely. And I'm just being careful on the top of my tray. Okay, so I'll finish that off. I'll let it dry. Even though Fusion has a built-in top coat, for a piece that's going to get a lot of use, like a tray or a Lazy Susan or a top of a dresser, I do like to add a finish to my paint. It's going to allow it to take a little bit more wear and tear. For this project, I've chosen the Fusion Clear Tough Coat in the gloss finish. You want to swirl it. Make sure it's well incorporated. Don't shake it. You don't want to get bubbles in there. I love the look of the gloss on marble. It really gives it a nice sheen. And we are going to apply 2 to 3 layers. That really makes this pop. You may decide that you want to use a matte polyacrylic sealer. That's fine too. I think it's just preference, but I do love a gloss finish on the marble. I think it really helps to magnify those layers that are underneath. So again, I would apply 2 to 3 coats. Of the clear in a gloss finish or a matte if that's what you decide. Let it dry completely between coats. Make sure you're always checking too that your edges don't have drips. And that you don't have major brush strokes. Now, you can decide if you wanted to, you could add a Lazy Susan mechanism to the bottom of this, or you can add screen door handles to this. I like the look of that because it doesn't compete with your pattern going on. You might want to paint some in the rose gold metallic to match the rose gold edging that you did. I would screw those in, let this dry completely. What a fantastic project. And then once you get this down, you can do the top of a dresser, your kitchen countertops, all kinds of really awesome ways that you can incorporate the Carrera marble with this faux finish technique. Thanks so much for watching, you guys.